Telemetry and Observability in .NET Aspire with Matt McCleary.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies using .NET and Azure, and we build mission-critical software, rescue failing projects, always empowering software delivery with a proven approach. I am excited to announce that my latest book is now fully released. The book is about software leadership. It's called The 5 Pillars: Leadership for Effective Custom Software. And the book is for anyone who's attempting to make a custom software team highly effective. If you want your team to deliver world-class results, this book may be for you. Teams are also doing book studies and discussions around it, and I'm excited about that. And if you, dear listener, would like a complimentary electronic copy of the book, you can just send me an email. I'd be happy to get that to you. And you can also find it hardcover, softcover on Amazon, ebook on Kindle, as well as audiobook on audible.com. And we also have a video training course that has just been released out about it. You can find that on clearmeasure.com. And for those of you who are lead architects or a team lead, or even in a software executive role, you might want to join our monthly forums. These are interactive, deeply technical sessions that I really enjoy facilitating. You can sign up on clearmeasure.com, and there's a forum for architects, and then there's a different forum for software executive managers. And so you can find that clearmeasure.com/developers/forums. And now we'll get into the show. My guest today, I'm excited about, is Matt McCleary. And Matt is a senior product manager at Microsoft working on observability tools to empower developers to be successful. He started his career in engineering. He's worked in tech for 10 years, the latest 8 of those at Microsoft, and he's been on the Azure Monitor team for most of that time. His passion is listening to customers and finding ways to make their product better. And in his spare time, he finds himself coaching his 8-year-old son's basketball team and playing an adult men's basketball league. Well, Matt, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Thanks, Jeffrey. I'm glad to be here and recovering from the flu, but I think I'm in a good spot. So thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Well, glad for that recovery. You've done a lot with Azure Monitor, and I want to ask you about that, but I always like asking the guests to kind of go back in time a little bit. Are there any turning points or key events that might have been responsible for steering you in this direction and working in this field and in this space?
Yeah, there were, I think, a couple of key markers that brought me to this space. As a kid, always had an engineering bent, though I probably didn't realize it. I remember as a senior in high school or junior in high school, touring different colleges and sitting in an engineering department and then fidgeting with the stuff on the guy's desk that I was interviewing with. He was the director of an engineering department. And my mom told me to stop touching his desk. And he said, no, that's okay. Engineers do that. They'll just grab. I actually leave that there on purpose to see if they'll grab it and start fidgeting with it. So that was kind of validating. There was another turning point, though. I went into the traditional engineering disciplines, civil engineering, actually, because I had my reasons. But then eventually I got to a point in my career where I realized, gosh, I'm just not really enjoying this. I wanted to do something that felt more kind of on the pioneering or on the front boundary of what was happening, and also slightly closer to the business and the customer. And so I did go through a bit of a career reflection and found myself interviewing for different jobs and ended up with the help of a mentor in a business intelligence consulting role, which I did for a couple years and just kind of strengthened my understanding of SQL and data warehousing and some of those basic data concepts. And then from that, found my way into telemetry. So it was a bit of an unconventional journey, but I'm very happy with with where I landed. And I guess it was partly purposeful, but also I would have never been able to predict it either. So
Nice. Well, Microsoft has just been doing so much to make developers' lives easier and building better tools. And at the same time, even though the building blocks of software have kind of been consistent for some time, the tools and what developers can use continues to move on at a fast pace. But some of the principles that have come out around knowing what the software is doing and being able to observe it, and then the open telemetry standard. I mean, I remember early in my career, it was, well, figure out a way to write some words to a log file, and then you just try to figure out how to bring that together and somehow get a sense of what the program is doing and what all the different pieces of the program are doing that are spread around, that are trying to orient with each other. And so when it comes to Azure Monitor specifically, can you maybe for people who haven't really tried it since maybe App Insights was out, years ago, what's the strategy? What is it trying to accomplish?
yeah, good question. So, right, I actually grew up with open telemetry at Microsoft. So at the Azure Monitor team. So when I first started, we were just thinking, let's try to create this open telemetry project and embark on this journey to see if we can replace our instrumentation with open source. And gosh, that was now, I guess, 6 years ago. And here we are 6 years later, and it's basically kind of become the de facto standard, right? So, and that's been one of my projects, ensuring that it gains acceptance across the company. So I think Azure Monitor as a product is kind of driven by a few strategic pillars. It's that when you're running on Azure, we just want to be there where you are, whether you're, whatever compute you're running on, or whether you're running on the edge and using something like Azure Arc. And then we want to be able to ingest your telemetry across your full stack and be able to reason over that telemetry, make sense of it for you, and surface up insights, whether it's at the application layer, like we're talking about with OpenTelemetry being the means of collecting it, or at your resource layer where you're collecting Azure resource logs or metrics. And then we do, the last two pillars are we do want to be open and extensible, and that we're a platform first. So if you want to plug in, bring your own tools like ServiceNow or PagerDuty, or there's all sorts of different configurations where customers bring their own tools and use parts of Azure Monitor and then use parts of their own, and that's totally fine. Like, we want customers to be successful first and foremost on Azure. And observability can be, let's face it, sometimes it can get a bit complicated. We want to try to make it easy, but there's all sorts of different configurations that work for folks. And so we need that flexibility so folks can do that. And then lastly, we really strive to make things enterprise grade and secure. And particularly that's been a huge focus this last year, as we've all seen the news. So yeah, that's the vision of Azure Monitor, and kind of everything we do is meant to really accrue value to those strategic pillars.
Yeah. Well, I love that the strategy around it isn't to drive just product adoption or product usage, but it's around the open source definition now of observability. And so there's a lot of developers who are still kind of ramping up on those three concepts that are, metrics, logs, and the traces. And so I think developers are introduced to logs first, where you just, write out some type of message somewhere, and then you figure out what it means. But I think a lot of developers aren't as well versed on metrics. It's like, well, what does it mean? Oh, you get metrics for free. It's just CPU usage. But beyond the ones that .NET will just kind of emit automatically, how should developers be thinking about metrics that their custom code should be recording?
Yeah, it's a good question. The three pillars was popularized by, I can't remember the name of the author, but it was published in an O'Reilly book. And I think it's a useful starting point for thinking of observability. It's not that all telemetry signals from your application strictly fit into 3 pillars. For example, you may have profiles coming from your application. Well, they don't fit into the 3 pillar, but yeah, so we can think of it as, logs, traces, and metrics. And we start with logs, and then, layering on top spans, which are the building blocks, into traces, which you can think of those as like just highly structured logs. And with that structure, we're able to stitch together the distributed views that make it
Mm-hmm.
possible to debug. And then we come to metrics. And metrics, when it comes from your application, so just taking a step back, a metric is just a counter. It's just thinking, it's just a count
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah.
And so, you could, in theory, you might be thinking like, well, I could just log numbers or add up my logs, and that's a metric. Yes, that's true. That is one way to think of a metric. But the issue there is it's expensive, it's not efficient, and it's not really the purpose of logs. Like, generally, a log store, it functions very different from a metric store, a metrics backend. One is a time series database, and the other, is often like a columnar store. That's how it is in Azure Monitor.
Mm-hmm.
And so for metrics, what OpenTelemetry does, and Prometheus client, but really OpenTelemetry is kind of the um, the next generation of Prometheus client, is it pre-aggregates metrics in the application process, and that allows you to then drop raw events if you want to, and it allows your metrics to proceed to a metrics backend unaffected by sampling. Okay, so separate from the process counters that the .NET just emits automatically,
Mm-hmm.
you could want to use that for something like, or you would want to use that for something like request count, because you're not going to want to necessarily send a log for every request to your backend, because it's expensive, it's
Yeah.
chatty. And so what it does is, in process, it'll just add them up over a minute, drop the raw events, and send off the pre-aggregated metric event.
Mm.
So that's how it works. You can also add custom metrics on top of that, and you can really use metric for anything you want to measure. It could be the number of times someone adds something to a shopping cart. You can use metrics to measure temperature. They have, depending on the type of measure, they have different tools available, whether it's a gauge, a counter, a histogram. And
Yeah.
you just look at the tools that are available. You try to figure out, okay, which one's going to best meet my use case, and that's the one you use.
I talked about this on some other podcasts, but just because it's public, I can talk about it openly. And one of the client projects that we did was livestock auctions for county fairs, and one of the pieces of information that everyone supporting the software wanted to know was how many people were watching a particular auction at any given period of time. And they want kind of a line graph of like, oh, how many. What is that line graph? Is it is it 50 people? Is it 200? Is it 1,000? And at the same time, with multiple auctions going on across the country at any given time, by adding the ID of the fair, they were able to split it out and say either total across the software, or no, for this particular really popular fair, how many people are watching this fair? And we were using application insights, part of Azure Monitor, and the project just by sending, just using the C# SDK, sending that number, because the application code kind of knew that for a particular auction, it was pretty darn simple and powerful.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it also brings us to another important concept, which is that metrics, like you said, they get powerful when you add dimensions, because you can split them. But that's also when it can get expensive. Something like auction would be probably considered low cardinality. Maybe there's in the order of 10 or 20 auctions. But if you were to start all of a sudden splitting the metrics by items sold, say at the auction,
yeah, a lot of them,
that could blow up the number of time series. And the way metrics work is because they're pre-aggregated in the application, you're not aggregating in the back end. So in other words, it has to create a new time series for every possible combination. And so that's a cross multiplier. And so so the cool thing though is, well, one, I mean, you have to be careful with cardinality. You have to use metrics appropriately, and splitting by auction is perfect. That's exactly the type of thing you would want to do. But the other cool thing is some of our recent investments in Azure Monitor have been around improving the capacity for our back end to handle huge increases in the number of time series. So with the Azure Monitor Workspace, which is our next generation metrics store, metrics backend, it now does 1 million active time series by default, and it can be scaled up to 50 million. And that's actually, it turns out that's actually quite a lot. And metrics tend to actually be reasonably cheap per time series. So it can be a very cost-effective tool, and can even get up to reasonably high cardinality. But you still need to be careful that you don't, blow it up, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, distributed traces are another concept. Let's say a developer has a web application and then some sort of back-end job that triggers every hour to do something. And let's say they both have a couple metrics, they're both logging stuff. What does it mean to create a distributed trace, and how does that work?
Yeah. So a distributed trace, I think of it as a call from, at its most basic level, a call from one chunk of code to another chunk of code. So one chunk of instrumented code to another chunk of instrumented code, and often it's a network call, like out to a database or something like that, and it's got the key there is the segment between the two nodes, as we call them, the two chunks of codes, the two nodes, has a defined start time and a defined end time, and then it's got an ID, a unique ID, and it's got a parent ID, so it knows where it started and where it ended, and that makes up the span, right? And then so you can think of that as just the basic building block of a trace, span being the basic building block of a trace being multiple spans. So as the call propagates through the system, additional spans are generated, and you can think about now as the call fans out into multiple systems, now you have a trace tree, where there's multiple threads running, and that's where distributed tracing becomes very valuable, because you begin to see, okay, there's several different call paths here. Which one is the bottleneck? Which is the one that if I were to work on reducing the duration of the spans in this particular path, I could actually improve the end user experience. And a good tracing view can help you answer that question. And I think Application Insights does have a good one with the end-to-end transaction view. There's other open source tools out there as well that you can use. So that's kind of breaking it down, I think, and as best I can. Yeah.
For the longest time, when structured logging came out, where you could log it with JSON and actually have dimensions or tags added in the log instead of it just being a line in a text file, for the longest time, The technique would be, oh, let me put some type of identifier or the user ID in the log files, and then let me manually go and look at this server log file filtered by this particular user who is doing something and reporting a problem from the client applications, calling back on the server and doing it manually. But that everybody needs to be able to do this. Even just a Blazor web application, one particular user that has, some .NET code running in the browser. It's a SPA application after all. But then the web server, there's tons of web service calls from all over the place hitting, and just being able to narrow down quickly and saying, okay, what happened because this particular user clicked a button? I mean, everybody needs to know that.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that's kind of how it used to be at Microsoft as well, and it's just kind of gradually gotten more advanced and correlated and standardized, and this has all made it easier. I mean, I think of the the diagnostic journey as generally it can be different, but one way to think of for each scenario, but one way to think about it is, okay, you notice there's some kind of issue with a metric, a dip, it falls below your SLO, and then that takes you to a trace, and then that particular trace helps you zero in on a specific node with an issue, and then the correlation between the log and the trace via the ID stamped on the logs that's correlated with the trace kind of takes you to the specific set of logs or exceptions that are responsible for the issue that then sort of take you to the code that's that's the problem. So including customers impacted as well. So I kind of think of it as this journey that starts with the metric and works down through this. In reality, it looks pretty. I mean, many developers are very familiar with their logs. They still go to their logs. I mean, that's okay. There's no. I'm not saying there's any right or wrong way to do it, but I'm saying there is kind of this beautiful symmetry that's developing between how all the signals kind of flow together and lead you to the issue. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now,
yeah.
Application Insights, it's for the longest time, it's had, first class citizen called a custom event. Where does that concept fit in with Open Telemetry, which doesn't explicitly talk about this concept of an event?
Yeah, good question. This has been a debate in the Open Telemetry community now for a good 6 months out in the specification SIG, and much longer in the real user monitoring SIG, which one of our developers was engaged with. And the idea being that there's potentially like a difference between a diagnostic log and a business event. I think where the community landed on this was that there is such a thing as events. They will use the OpenTelemetry logging API, and events will be defined by their name, and they will be semantically defined in the OpenTelemetry semantic conventions. So again, you can think of an event as like a log with some additional structure.
Like when someone made a bid, that's something that happened, right? Somebody bid on an item at an auction. I'm thinking somebody made a bid.
That's a bid. It's a bid event. It's an action event. It's a user action. So exactly. So there is very, very soon here, there's a way to do that in OpenTelemetry, and we're going to be rolling that out in Azure Monitor as well. We try not to get ahead of the community in Azure Monitor, which can be tricky because a customer is saying, I want to use OpenTelemetry, but there's just this one thing that you don't have, and then we push in the community, and depending on where the community's at, it can take a bit longer, to get people thinking about it and to get folks engaged. And then at some point, things happen very, very fast in OpenTelemetry. It's kind of like a snowball. It takes a long time for it to pick up speed, and then all of a sudden, there it goes.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it's done. So
Right.
so it's made working in open source is just can take on a life of its own. But yeah, so I think custom events are a thing. They're in application insights and and they're useful for something like some business event, some that you can instrument in your code, and then events themselves are a thing in OpenTelemetry, and that kind of is going to continue to be defined in the semantic conventions in OpenTelemetry. There's going to be all sorts of different types of events.
Well,
So,
I had to do a little brain twister, just having had freeform logs since the late 90s, and then of course the morph to structured logs, where it's like, oh, now it could look like JSON or XML, and I can now filter it, but it's still logs, to how like the standard open telemetry wants us to literally on opentelemetry.io in the docs. Literally, it says, what's a log? It's, quote, a recording of an event. And I'm thinking, okay, that doesn't jive with 25 years of how I thought about what was in a log file. So I'm like doing gymnastics in my head to think about it a little bit differently.
Yeah, I mean, the taxonomy is kind of evolving in industry, and I think, the good thing is like OpenTelemetry is creating more of a standard taxonomy. But I will say in that particular area, log versus events, I don't know that it's all 100% static yet. It seems like there's still some debate in the community on where things are going to land. Yeah.
Well, that's good. Having smart people arguing over things. Well, yeah, it's already fantastic just to be able to talk about the language that if your application is not recording any metrics, you might have a gap and want to think about that. If it's not, correlating between different running processes, any distributed traces, you might have a gap and want to think about that.
Yep. And right. And it's just at some level, it's good to just keep it simple. It's like, if you see a gap, try to fill it and go from there. Observability doesn't need to be perfect. It's a journey. It's an iterative journey.
Yeah. Well, and I do just a lot of coaching and advising, just in doing consulting for so long. And if you get rid of all the jargon, I always come back to the question: at any moment in time, do you know what the software is doing right now? Do you know what the software has done? Do you know what all of your users are doing with your software? If the answer is no, okay, there's a gap somewhere.
Yep. It's good. Yeah.
So what's next for Azure Monitor?
Yeah, good question. So we're focused on several areas. So in the we're going into our plan. We do buy a twice yearly planning, so we're about to go into our planning cycle. But one of the areas we're focused on is improving what we call workload observability, or service group observability, and is kind of is I think along the lines of what you're saying, with being a bit more customer centric, in the sense that giving customers more flexibility to group their service around the way they see their business, and then being able to annotate those key transactions as the business views it, and not sort of as Azure calls it, in our infrastructure names or whatever. So I think that's a big focus of ours. Another one is we want to make it easier for customers to set SLIs and SLOs in Azure Monitor. It's possible today using KQL and the alerting platform, and use workbooks, but we want to make it more of like a first class kind of thing. So that's a big area of investment. And then we continue to, not surprisingly, invest in AI ops. So, making it more automated, for the system to detect issues and suggest resolutions for customers. So yeah, those are the sorts of things you're going to see rolling out at a platform level. We've done a lot of work to stratify our logging tiers so that if you're doing something like saving audit logs, you can shoot them off to a cheaper logging tier. You rarely look at them, but
Mm-hmm.
which is why you pay far less money if you send to that tier, because turns out querying is expensive, and so we want to credit customers for that and make sure that they have that lower cost option for based on their use case. And and so we continue to do work to make all those logging tiers easier to understand and also integrated, so you can like rehydrate from one tier to another. So
Mm-hmm.
it's all kind of this interconnected platform. So yeah, I mean, and there's a lot more too, the going on across Grafana, Azure Managed Grafana, cost optimization, VM Insights, and Azure Managed Prometheus. I mean, there's all sorts of investments going on, but yeah, I think those are the big ones.
Nice, nice. Well, you've done a lot of work with the .NET Aspire team and Azure Monitor that kind of in integrating those two. And I don't know if the plans have solidified or not, but with Aspire working on interacting with the Azure Developer Console and even creating new Azure resources from scratch based on the structure of the app host and what dependencies are in there. Do you think that it will get to the point where for a brand new Aspire application upon deployment to a pre-production environment that will get scripts kind of automatically that create all the resources necessary so that an Azure Monitor instance and the related resources are kind of spun up the way that they should be from scratch?
I think we could get to that point soon. What we're waiting on from the Azure Monitor side is we're kind of doing some major backend work to converge our ingestion pipeline and kind of setting ourselves up for future scale. And it's going to have native open telemetry ingestion. And so then at that point, anybody using Aspire could just point to our OTLP backend, and maybe there's an additional box you check, spin up Azure Monitor resources. I think one of the keys, from what I understand about Aspire, is at least they by default they want to be vendor neutral, but then
Mm-hmm.
if you're and so the Open Telemetry uses the Open Telemetry protocol, but then if you wanted to check a box or something, you could probably get Azure Monitor all spun up. So I imagine that would be the direction. Yeah. Though I haven't specifically talked to the team about that, is my caveat, but
Gotcha.
it
Yeah,
sounds really good. I think I will right after this call. So thanks, Jeffrey.
sure. Well, as we close up, just helping the developers and everyone listening think about it. In your opinion, does it fit the best to have one Azure Monitor instance for all of your applications, or a different instance of Azure Monitor for different applications, the same one for all of your environments of that application, production, testing, uh, dev environments? Or how do you think about the guidance for when a separate Azure Monitor instance should be used versus having one that multiple things funnel into?
That's a good question. Yeah, we have some documentation on it. It does depend, but generally, I think so. The core building block of Azure Monitor is the log analytics workspace. That's where all the data is stored.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think of it as, if you can, just one log analytics workspace per region, because that consolidates all your data into one workspace. And then you would want a separate one for like, production, and so your test telemetry didn't pollute your production resource. And that would kind of avoid any like cross-region data charges. And then I think, probably make you a bit more resilient. Though I have heard of customers who just have one log analytics workspace in a region, and they do the cross-region data source, and they want to send everything to that log analytics workspace
Mm-hmm.
just because they really want everything to be in one place. And now with availability zones, I mean, even if you're in a region with an availability zone, with that, it's still pretty resilient, So I think generally, as few as possible is my point of view. And then as requirements drive you to do more, like say like, oh boy, I have this like really kind of complicated RBAC requirement where I can only have this certain group of people have access to this data, oh shoot. Yeah, I guess you got to need another log analytics workspace, right? Or so let the requirements drive you to do more. Otherwise, do less. And be careful about one thing. When you automatically sign up for monitoring in something like app service, if you don't select your existing log analytics resource, it will by default spin up a new one.
Yeah.
And so you can end up having a proliferation of these resources almost by accident. And so, kind of pay attention when you're spinning up new Azure resources. You can select an existing log analytics resource. And even though it's a different application insights resource, it's still running off the same underlying log analytics resource. So you can think of those app insights resources as just projections on top of the log analytics resource.
So correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like the general, most of the time, it's best to have one log analytics resource per organization unit or department at the company, whatever group of people work together, right?
Yeah.
And then am I hearing a different, or how many application insights? Is it a different application insight per piece of custom software?
Yeah, there's no real like hard and fast rules around application insights resources. And I mean, part of the thing with, what I mentioned about workload service group observability is app insights resources are going to become increasingly less important because you'll be able to define your application boundary. But yeah, you can just think of app insights resource as like kind of a useful bucket boundary to store data for like RBAC and just creating like a view for a particular developer, on his piece of software. And so I think, just whatever is useful to the application developer team in terms of like how many resources, to effectively manage their part of the service is fine, and as long as they're all kind of flowing into the same log analytics workspace, it keeps it more streamlined from a billing and kind of systems perspective.
So, large companies is really complicated anyway, but if I shrink it down to a company that has one software team, maybe they have, a handful of software applications, but as one software team, it sounds like there would be two log analytics workspaces, one for production, one for non-production. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then as many application insights resources as seems useful, like maybe one for every application and environment for each application.
Yeah. I mean, or chunk of application if you want to like give an application, to a chunk, or just kind of depends what works for you.
So if I have a application that has a web application, a web service process that has to be deployed, a Azure SQL database, a few batch jobs or queue listeners, if I have like 6 things that have to be deployed for this one application, for the production environment, I would have one application insights for all 6 of those running processes, but I would not want to have 6 application insights just because I have 6 deployed processes.
Right. You wouldn't need to have that, But I mean, one thing that to keep in mind is as long as you have access to all the data, even if the data is split between multiple application insights resource, distributed tracing still works across the indexer works across multiple resources. So the only kind of like data boundary that happens is in your performance and failures diagnostic experiences. So there is some data boundary, but in terms of like distributed tracing, the thing we talked about earlier, that spans multiple resources. So it's not like you're locking yourself into a box when it comes to the power of distributed tracing.
So if I have 6 significant software systems, each of them having their own application insights for their production environment, if all of them were referencing the same log analytics workspace, then I'd be able to have views that show me some views across all 6 of those significant software systems.
Right. In any of those 6 application insights resources, if you went to the application map and you hit show more, it would show all 6 nodes and all 6 resources. So
Perfect. Awesome. Well, that's good. I know that helps people think about how to structure this and how it's designed. So fantastic. Well, Matt, thanks so much for coming on the Azure and DevOps podcast and sharing all the work that you and your team are doing with Azure Monitor and Open Telemetry and Aspire. I appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.